Hi everyone. So my topic for the professional article was stem cell research, and at first it was a little difficult to do because since it is a scientific topic, there was a lot of shuffling through what stem cell research was in the first place. So basically I'm going to start by describing what stem cell research is, and then I'll talk about the pros and the cons of it and how it relates to things that could be considered unethical. So first of all, stem cell research is when scientists and researchers are going into cells, like human cells, and they are retrieving certain pieces of the cell called stem cells, which they can then work with in the lab, and then they're working on regrowing them so that they can be placed into somebody else's body for things like heart failure. So the stem cells from the lab would be placed into a failing heart, and then the stem cells would re-stimulate, and then they would start growing and healing the damaged heart tissue so that it could basically just regenerate itself and grow a new heart for that person instead of them either dying of heart failure or having to wait for a complete organ transplant. So it sounds really great, but the problem is that the stem cells normally come from embryonic cells. So that means that they're taking baby cells before they're actually considered a baby, and they are opening them up, which is essentially killing them if you believe an embryo is a human. And so there's a lot of debate back and forth whether an embryo is considered a human and if stem cell research is killing of humans, or if it is just the destruction of an embryo before it's actually a human being. So there's two different ways of looking at whether a stem cell is a human being or just an embryo. And some people believe that an embryo is a human being from fertilization. And so as soon as the egg is fertilized by the sperm, it would be considered a human. And then other people believe that they're not considered an actual human until 14 days after fertilization, which is when they actually enter the uterus and start developing human characteristics, and they become more than just tissue mass. So, depending on how people believe what determines a human being compared to just an embryo, determines whether people are for or against stem cell research most of the time. There's also stem cell research that is using adult stem cells, which they get stem cells from living adults. And so they could take stem cells out of, for example, bone marrow, and then they would have to regenerate it and then place it back into that same person's body so that the stem cells could regenerate the damaged part. And the thing about adult stem cells is that they don't have as many uses as the embryonic stem cells do, because embryonic stem cells are non-specific cells, which means they can regenerate to any type of cell. They are non-specific. They become any cell that they need to be in order to fix the problem, while adult cells are less specific, and they are actually more specific, and so that they are not able to go into every part of the body and fix the problem. They would have to be put into a certain part of the body to be counted as they would be helpful to regenerate. And then when adult cells are transferred, they can only be transferred from that person into the same person, instead of embryonic cells can be moved into any person. And then another problem that comes up ethically is that a lot of the times with transplants and stem cells, they can be rejected by the receiver because the DNA doesn't match their DNA, since it's technically someone else. So then ethically, they talk about cloning people so that the DNA could be identical from the stem cell to the receiver of the stem cells. So once we start talking about cloning, then people get even more worried, because once that technology is actually developed, there are other negatives that could go along with it, and then once it's developed, it's kind of out of our control to where it's used, and not only used for stem cells, but it could be used for negative things in the future. So with stem cell research, they are trying to decide whether it should be government funded in the United States or not, which means that taxpayer dollars would essentially be set aside so that scientists and researchers could use that portion of the money to investigate whether stem cell research is actually something successful that would be beneficial for humans. And I guess I should say what they actually use stem cells for. So in cases like I mentioned earlier with heart failure, a lot of the times it could regenerate a heart. There's also some proof with rats and things in the lab that stem cells can cure diabetes because the new cells learn how to create their own insulin like they would naturally. So now they're in the body and they're creating the insulin and stopping diabetes. Also, things like spinal cord injuries, when the nerve cells have been damaged and are essentially, when it comes to like a complete spinal cord injury, there's no chance for it to be healed. And so there's no regrowth of nerve cells. Nerve cells can't repair themselves. The nerve cells never regenerate. So with stem cells, they can be placed into a paraplegic, and then they might be able to heal their spinal cord and potentially gain function or feeling or walking again. And so there's a lot of beneficial things that could come out of stem cells, but there's also a lot of negative and ethical concerns that go along with it. So the articles that I chose compared the pros and the cons of stem cells and whether they think that the United States should be funding it and regulating it in our government, which means that there's also even more ethical concern that if taxpayers are paying for it and it's a funded government process, then taxpayers might not agree with how embryos are considered humans. So somebody could believe that an embryo is a human right after fertilization, and then in the lab they could be using them up to 14 days. So then taxpayers would essentially be paying for something that they are completely against. They could be considered it killing of a human being, yet they are forced to pay for it. So there's a lot of debate about that. There's a lot of debate about cloning. And then people ask where the stem cells come from. So where would we get all the embryos from if this was approved? And they would take the embryos from things like planned abortions, which they're afraid that it could increase the abortion rate because they know that it would go towards research to potentially cure terminal diseases and conditions. So they're worried that if people are on the fence about whether they're going to abort their baby or give it up for adoption or even keep it, that they'll just go ahead and abort it because they think that something positive will come out of it. So a lot of pro-life arguments are also coming up to try to make sure that if that does happen and they do use aborted embryos, that it wouldn't actually increase the abortion rates. And then they could also use embryos from in vitro storage, because when people donate sperm or eggs or anything like that, they are stored. And then sometimes there's an access to that could be granted, and then they could use like the extra fertilized embryos as test subjects to determine whether stem cell research would be beneficial or not. And then they are also talking about creating their own stem cells or their own embryos to use for stem cell research in test tubes. So then they would essentially be making life just to take it away by adding sperm and egg into a test tube, and then it becomes fertilized into an embryo. And then once it's an embryo, they would then deconstruct it to get out this the stem cell to use for research to see if it would be possible to help humans who are living but suffering from terminal diseases. So there's a lot of debate about whether stem cell research is something that is ethically okay, and if it is something that should be regulated by the government, and therefore taxpayer money would be paying for it because it would be government funded and government regulated. And on a side note, some other countries are already doing this. The UK has already approved it, and they do have regulations for it, but they have been excessively studying stem cell research for a few years now. And so America would not be the only one who is considering this or even doing this. There are other countries doing it too, so now America just has to decide whether we're going to be part of it or what we consider killing of human life. So my question for you guys is, do you consider an embryo a human, or to what regulations do you consider it a killing of a human being? And depending on that, do you agree with stem cell research for the benefit of the human population as a greater whole, or do you think it's that it's against your ethics and your morals to kill a human being for research, even if it was already doomed anyway, like in the case of abortions or extra in vitro, that would be basically thrown away anyway? Do you believe that it would be ethical to make the government fund this research, potentially saving lives, but also potentially killing? So I hope you got a little bit of information about stem cell research and have enough information to make your decision.